general, it's very important to check everything that you believe.
Some of the newer practitioners,
so much misinformation out there.
It's healthy to question your ideology.
Take people's unverified personal gnosis.
All these different bad habits like
reasonings with ourselves and going over rationality.
Thinking everyone's against you, thinking everyone else is wrong.
Escapism.
Attacking others because they don't agree with you.
Where they don't want to deal with like any negativity or any criticism.
The right hand and the left hand path.
And it feels like a personal attack against you.
Any sort of darkness or badness in their life.
Where the dichotomy begins.
It's important to open yourself.
Is it really valuable or meaningful?
My name is AIDEN.
GEORGINA.
Chandler.
Welcome to Occultism, the side of salt.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about an issue that plagues our communities. Whether you're in any tradition, a Kabbalist, a mystic, a New Ager, a little baby Wiccan, or anywhere in between, it's the rise of gurus. So gurus have existed in religious communities for forever, but in modern times, they can be a little hit or miss. Sometimes you can find a mentor or a teacher or a guru who can take your spiritual practice to the next level, being the wheels on the car that gets you to your final destination. But a lot of the time, there's toxic gurus who teach and who abuse their power and take advantage of the people that they are learning under. So since we know our audience is a combination of practitioners of many levels, we wanted to talk about this because I think this applies to everyone and is a lesson we should all take home. So we're going to be talking about how these relationships become toxic, what to avoid, and what to keep in mind when you're looking for teaching, a guru, or anything in either mysticism, occultism, witchcraft, or whatever religious or spiritual practice you currently follow or are interested in the future.
I think one of the first things that always sticks out to me is the price that some of these people have. Sometimes it's overly expensive, like you're paying $100 for very basic teaching, or you're paying $500 for something you could easily Google, anything like that. And I think that's where my main issue lies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, honestly, if someone asks for money for their teaching, that's not inherently a bad thing because they are giving a lot of time and resources that they worked very hard on to learn to pass on. But the issue lies with how much these people are charging. Like, if you're paying $10 for an hour-long lecture at an in-person shop near your area, that's very reasonable to me, and I don't see any sort of issues with that. But if you're online and you're paying for a webinar and it's hundreds of dollars, that's a huge issue to me because I really don't see how any teaching can be worth such the obscene prices that some of these people charge. Like, the majority of the time when you take a beginner online class, I'm going to talk about classes first because there are a lot of them right now. I get ads on my Facebook feed. I think every time I open my Facebook, I get like 20 ads for various classes and workshops online. And honestly, any online class where no one's talking to you one-on-one and it's like these big group classes or they're pre-written and you just kind of click through them lecture style, if they're more than like $20-$30, I think that's a massive red flag because some of these classes are hundreds of dollars, and if they're geared towards beginners, like very, very beginners, they're going to be basic information. And since these classes want to appeal to the most amount of people as possible, they're going to make them as broad as they can. So when you've got a broad beginner class, that's going to be very simplified and watered down, and nothing really like significant or personal is going to come out of that. It's going to be like probably information you could read in a Cunningham or Buckland book, which is half the price of your course. Like, I took one of these classes, actually. Not going to give any information about the name of it or anything or how much it costs, but I took this one for beginner practitioners just because I was curious what beginners were learning. And especially there were beginners I was interacting with a bit. And I took it, and I felt so ripped off. It literally, like, it was rehashed information. It was these really short articles. And I learned absolutely nothing. Like, it was a huge waste of time and energy and money. And so when I see these beginner classes, especially ones that I've seen there's this new thing that I keep seeing where these like weird fringe universities offer classes in really niche things that I don't understand how they, like, there's so many of them that you don't know if there's actually like a real person even writing them. It's a huge red flag. I think if you're looking for a class, you need to know the credentials of who you're studying under. And I would never buy a class from anyone who's only been practicing for like a short amount of time or like 10 years or something. Like, if you're paying for education, you want someone who's studied this stuff, who has credentials. Like, I went to this amazing lecture taught by someone who is a researcher, and it was awesome. But like, if you're just finding some random person you follow on Instagrams doing these master classes, right? Like, they're an Instagrammer. They're not a religious researcher or someone who's been having really intense mystical experiences forever. And our podcast, like, we're nobodies. We're not, like, we're not some sort of, like, paid educational resource. I would definitely not consider us anywhere near that. So I just think you should be paying for a premium of learning from someone who has a lot of experience, and you should always, always ask people how long they've been studying and kind of quiz them on everything about them before committing to anything they teach or following anything they're pushing.
What I have seen, not only related to both cost and content, a lot of people get ripped off, like you said, for the school or classes that you went through, and I see a lot of people going and making these large investments in names that they like, or people who they are attracted to because they're very charismatic people or they're very well spoken, and they don't mind spending all these money because they think they're supporting someone, and they think that this person has these credentials because of how charismatic they are. I think a huge problem in the whole guru explosion, because anyone who can read and understand something and feed it back to someone can call themselves a guru and put their own little twists and turns on it. But with the whole media age, I think that a lot of people who are kind of on this path of like, oh, I want to start to know stuff, I want to go under a mentor, and they see all of these options and all of these people claiming to be gurus. It's kind of like picking one out of like a vending machine almost, or like just randomly digging one out of a box. And I feel like that's very like haphazardous, not haphazardous, but I feel like that's very dangerous to do, because it is basically putting your entire trust, your faith, your path into someone you don't know. You talked a bit on asking them their credentials. I've seen people who teach classes as if they were facts, and all of the information they know, they couldn't provide a source on, they couldn't cite anything, they couldn't warrant me any text, they couldn't do anything about any of my questions. Whenever I had follow-up questions, they were like, I'll get back to you on that, I'll get back to you on that, but I never received an answer for the questions I asked, and ultimately I think I annoyed them into kicking me out of the class. But it's one of these things where I see a lot of people put a lot of their faith in someone, and then what they can provide or what they do provide is so underwhelming, and you can easily do like a month's worth of work and get much more information on your own rather than trusting a guru to tell you everything.
Absolutely. I think that people overestimate how much information people hold, because you can very easily find out all these different things by a simple Google search or by reading things for much reduced costs. And the thing is, people will have their own personal biases and their own personal gnosis, which they will try to impart onto you, which can cause you to also fall into these narrow biases. Whereas if you're just reading and Googling, you will find out a lot more and from a lot more different sources.
Absolutely. And I think one of the problems with this, going back to one of the earlier things Chandler said, is that a large portion of the kind of celebrities or well-known people in the community that we look up to, like where we buy their books or whatnot, and follow them and know their name, are writers. Like, the majority of people who we think of as these great occultists aren't necessarily the best occultists or practitioners out there. They're just the people who are good at writing. Like, so much of our understanding and learning is from books, So when we're reading stuff, like, are we necessarily learning from the greatest individual practitioners? Because I know many, many great practitioners who just don't have an interest in writing or sharing. And so when we're looking at these things where we're learning from, I think we assume these people are necessarily, like, inherently the best occultists out there. Like, you see these books from these people being published by Weiser or Scarlet Imprint again and again and again, and I think we jump to this assumption. Or, like, even when you're having conversations with other occultists and you ask them, like, who do you think is the greatest practitioner of all time? Almost every single name they're going to pop at you is some sort of writer. And so I think we have this, like, I know the esoteric community is not the mainstream community where we have this large celebrity culture, but I think we definitely idolize these occult writers that we really like and put them on a massive pedestal and assume they're the best practitioners out there, when, honestly, some of the best practitioners of all time, we may have absolutely no clue who they are. Like, we really do sometimes fall into this trap of rating practitioners based on how good they are at writing or speaking, when that doesn't necessarily reflect their craft at all. Like, just because someone creates good content or speaks well or writes well does not mean they're the best occultist ever, and they could be bluffing for all you know. Like, we need to have a lot of skepticism when we idolize these people and put them on these pedestals, because we will never know someone's individual private practice. Because I think we all have aspects of our practice that we don't share. Like, I'm very open about a lot of things, but there's so much that I keep to myself. And so I think when we're talking about practitioners to look up to or skill, like, we'll never fully know. And I think we kind of need to realize that the best occultists aren't necessarily the ones who've been written about or done a lot of writing. And just remember, like, to not get caught in celebrity culture when it comes to spirituality, because I think that bleeds into our community a lot.
It's definitely a big thing that I see a lot. Like, if you can write well, you can speak well, then people will naturally gravitate towards you, even if the information you hold is complete and utter bullshit. Like, I know a lot of people gravitate towards certain sources because of they've seen them on YouTube, they've seen them on Instagram, and they like their content. Not specifically because of what the content actually is, but because of the way that they say it and the way that they present it. It's a nice format for them. And I think that's where people go wrong a lot, because they find these narrow sources and it starts to get into almost, I don't want to call them cults, but it gets into a lot of personality, let me rephrase this. It gets into a very big following around this person rather than what they're actually doing and saying.
Yes, I completely agree. I see this all the time. I think that sometimes, and I'm super guilty of it, there are certain occult blogs and videos and writers who I, like, kind of fangirl over. Like, I'm like, oh my god, they're so talented, and, like, get into, like, this kind of, like, stan culture thing. And I think we need to remember and always carry skepticism with us, and remember that, like, just because you've seen a YouTube video on something or a podcast on something doesn't mean that's right, and you should constantly be cross-checking. And with Mentors IRL, the same thing applies. Like, I know these people who are kind of raised in occult families, who are hereditary practitioners. I've met multiple in person, and they're all very amazing people, and I love hearing about their upbringing, where their parents taught them occultism at super young ages. They learned through hand-me-down teachings. But these people who are taught by their families, a lot of the time will have no interest in outside sources, and will have no interest in expanding their minds outside of the practices they were given, which becomes toxic extremely quickly, because if you're only getting your information from one source, you're gonna possibly get misinformation, and you're never gonna see the full extent of the esoteric world. And I see this to the most extreme degree with hereditary practitioners, which hereditary practitioners and their relationship with other practitioners, I think, could be a whole large thing to talk about. But I think they're far extreme. But I know most people with mentors who basically only listen to their mentor. They never read anything their mentor doesn't give them. They never have an interest in anything besides what they're directly told. And I think that's super toxic, because for all you know, you could be getting information that's extremely biased, extremely narrow-minded, because obviously, like, if I was to teach someone my practice, I'm going to teach only what I do. I'm not really going to give that broad perspective. Because in the end, your practice is your practice. And as someone who at one point was very rigid and only doing one specific strain and then opened her mind and literally had a complete change of course, like, I did not originally study Kabbalah. That was not where I began at all. I never thought I'd even read anything Kabbalistic for the longest time. And it's like, you just need to not be afraid to push out. And I think when you have a guru or a mentor, you're gonna have a narrow perspective a lot of the time. You're gonna be being told one thing, and I think that's really toxic. Like, sure, you may always stick to the exact practice you began in and never want to try anything else, and that's fine, but you should at least educate yourself on other things so you're not in an echo chamber. Because I think these mentor-mentee relationships, especially if the mentor has multiple people and it becomes this kind of religious group that can verge into culty at times, you should always be open-minded. And a big red flag, this is, I think, actually in the BITE model, which the BITE model, if you're not familiar with it, is a model for identifying cult behavior, is that you don't allow outside information and you keep it really restrictive. So if your mentor, like you mention another book and every single time they say it's bad, or every single time they're like, no, you can't read that, you can't talk about that, you can't study that, that is a huge red flag, and you should leave your mentor. I think if anything is wrong ever, and honestly, I think all occultists should read the BITE model. I'm going to link it below. And you should constantly be questioning things, and there is no shame ever in leaving a mentor, leaving a group, or leaving a path when you learn new information. And that should never be stigmatized, and you should always feel empowered and able to leave any relationship you're in.
You can cut this out if you want, but that's actually something I experienced when I was in the Catholic Church, because they would say, like, all these other religions, all these other different faiths, like, specific things that they said you cannot read about, you cannot look into that, you cannot listen to that information because it's bad, it's wrong, they're trying to turn you away from God, all these different things. A lot of what you were saying sounded very familiar to what I was brought into. And I can attest to how toxic it can be, especially when you're blocked from learning about all other information, or you're downright told that other information is dangerous for you to read and completely wrong and infactual.
And I want to stress this. So I've noticed recently, and there's a huge rise in online gurus and online teachers. Just because something's online or a community is online does not mean it's not a cult. Online cults exist. They're very prevalent. And just because something's on the internet doesn't mean it's different than something in person. You should treat these relationships you have online with mentors or other practitioners as the same way and with the same respect and the same skepticism and criticism that you would an in-person group that you find. I think people consider things online less serious or less personal or less risky, but that's not true, because you can brainwash someone through the internet. And I've seen online cults firsthand. I've known multiple people who have been involved with them. They took a lot of money from these people and really drained these people and hurt these people. And so I want to stress that just because something's online doesn't mean it's any different from, say, a specific Catholic church that is saying you can't read anything else or you're going to hell. If anything restricts your information or is brainwashing you or telling you things like you can't question anything ever, run. Even if it's just a community forum or server or discussion group, if it has this rigidity, leave. Just leave. I don't know another way to put it. Just leave.
Being able to have that freedom of asking questions like, why is this the way it is, or why is this structured this way, is what really is going to allow you to learn and understand these concepts that lie underneath the core of, I feel like, most to every practice. Being able to understand, like, these fundamentals of, like, why are you doing this? Why am I doing it this way, not that way? Like, why is it written to be done like this? Understanding the whys for a lot of things is what is going to make you want to do something. So to put someone in an environment and tell them a lot of information, and when they ask you why and not provide them with an answer, and tell them like basically create yourself in an image of like, well, I'm the way. Like, if you don't want to listen to me, then don't be, don't get my grace or whatever. And just kind of like dismissing any questioning or anything. And I think the reason for that is because when you introduce questions into environments like that, what you do is you create not only a question of practice but a question of authority, and then that will make the structure, like the scam, essentially crumble or shake at least. I feel like if there are teachers out there that are providing classes and they're not able to answer questions like why, or there are even if there are people that are teachers who are providing services at ridiculous prices, and and their answer of why is like their power, or if their answer of like why is something that's like ridiculous, or something that seems to be the notion of like, oh, just trust me, I know what I'm doing. Don't trust them. They do know what they're doing, and what they're doing is called scamming. You're scamming you. They're stealing your money. Like, they don't want you questioning them, because when you introduce that question of like, how do you know, why are we doing this, why are we following you, stuff like that, it just puts them at a position where they can lose their power over you. Authority, having authority over yourself is what makes you powerful as a person. But if you relieve that power to someone else and you let someone else have authority over you and your path, then they can control you. They can essentially brainwash you. But if you don't allow that, then their structure doesn't work. And that kind of attitude, I've seen, becomes infectious.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on the point you said about paid services. So I wanted to talk a bit about that, because I see that online a lot where people kind of pay for rituals or whatever, and it's typically hundreds of dollars. I've seen them ranging. I browse Etsy all the time. If anyone who's listening to this knows this to me personally, I'm constantly online shopping, even though I rarely buy things. It's a problem. But I spend a lot of time looking through esoteric shops on Etsy, and I notice that there's these paid services, and I notice on certain influencers' pages there's links where you can buy these rituals and these deeds, essentially. And I wanted to talk about how much they tend to cost, because they some of them are cheap, some of them are only like $20 or whatever, but some of them are hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And I cannot think of a single reason why someone doing a ritual for 30 minutes should cost that much. Because if you're talking material cost, because I saw one person kind of explaining why they had their price, I think it was $400, $500. And they're explaining that there was a material cost. But in the end, I mean, materials and tools, which is something I think new practitioners get really obsessed over. They like find these little shopping lists. They look through like either the Black Brick Israel Regarding Golden Dawn book, or I see it with Scott Cunningham, I think has an altar outline in his book. And they see these tools and these setups, and they spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on these setups, and sometimes if they can't afford these setups, they assume they need the entire thing to make anything happen, so they go, well, it's cheaper just to pay someone $200 to do something for me. And materials, and I mean, I'll link some stuff about plastic practice, but in the current times, there's this huge influence on stuff in the occult community and saying you need certain materials. And I've seen some gurus in some locations. I went to an IRL class at this center near my area on Kabbalistic practice, and they were trying to sell me things the entire time and sell me tools and sell me books and all this. And in the end, like, you can find a lot of occult books that are older on like various websites that archive sacred texts that are completely legal. And you don't really need tools at all in the end. Like, tools help you get there, but the tools themselves don't do anything. And there's absolutely no reason why you need an elaborate altar to do one thing. Like, the altar really isn't that important in the end. Like, it's a thing, but it's not, like, things are not why this stuff is such a value. And so seeing a ritualist say that they needed hundreds of dollars for supplies, it just made me laugh, because there's no way for a single thing they're using all that money. Like no, that's absurd and that's obscene. And I think these gurus who are trying to make a profit off you are going to really probably influence stuff and things to sell you, and never, like, give you a cheap way to do things, because trust me, there is always a cheap way to do something. If you need a tool, you can get it for a lot cheaper than you think if you just use a little bit of creativity. And so I think these people and these gurus, if anyone's ever trying to sell you stuff all the time, or tell you need all this stuff or these super expensive tools, I would avoid it. I think that's a major red flag, because, like, way back when people were discovering folk practice, especially, like, they didn't have, like, this, like, grandiose altar, and they didn't use it. They just had what they had around. Like, the reason why dirt and jars are used so heavily in witchy topics or folk practice is because these were mostly downtrodden, poor people, mostly women and people of color, who really didn't have anything else to give them empowerment, so they used whatever they had. And I think that spirit of ingenuity and creativity is kind of the soul of folk practice. Like, I think the fact that, especially, I see this the most in folk magic communities, like, they focus so much on these things, and that's kind of the antithesis of what the original folk practitioners were doing. And it's just very, very ironic to me. And I think these gurus really push this because they're trying to profit off people. And, like, you never need that many tools. And you can have an elaborate, like, I know people who do elaborate rituals with no tools. Just, like, an expo marker. Take an expo marker, draw a circle on the floor. It's janky, but it works. And so I just think anyone who is obsessed with money, or selling you services or readings, which buying a reading occasionally is completely normal and good, but if someone's constantly pushing stuff on you, pushing other classes, pushing things, and it just overtakes the content, I think you need to leave, because that person is trying to make a coin off you. Because I think a lot of people position themselves as gurus because they know it's profitable.
Yeah, I see a lot of investment in kind of this material good, this altar space, this kind of buying your spirituality. And that's really what it does come down to, is people want a capital option for enlightenment. They don't want to read, they don't want to do the work. I mean, even in our own circles, we're not gurus or teachers of any sort. We're possibly leaders at most, but only in our, like, small circles, and we lead few, and we lead very freely. We just give our suggestions to people if they ask for them. And I feel like whenever you try to sell the service, of course you want a customer who's going to come back again and again and again. That's the whole reason why people give you coupons, or you are asked to get a subscription service and instead of a single time purchase and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, if you want a customer to return, you're going to want to tell them you need this product to do so many things. For instance, the number one thing that I am completely just, I can't seem to find the origin source or what wave started this, but a big thing that I am not a fan of, I'm not going to attack anyone who is of the practices that I'm about to mention, but I personally dislike with great intensity the hard focus on crystals practitioners have these days. If you need something done, there's a crystal for it. But the problem with that is that witchcraft in of itself should be the solution for your problem. That tool that you use should be something optional, something that you choose to use to empower it. And even at that, I think that the inflated prices that we see for crystals, both fake, real, tumbled, raw, all across the board, not like non-jewelry crystals, you know, like actual like crystals that we see sold in metaphysical shops and shops like Spencer's and Hot Topic and stuff like that. We have this kind of, as a modern culture, we have this obsession with having this aesthetic around us. An aesthetic is a powerful thing, but it's not something that's necessary. When you take away the necessity from the practice and you try to convolute it and you make it about something it's not, it's going to be very easy to, instead of being a spiritual teacher, to be a salesman. But you can come off as a spiritual teacher while being a salesman. You just have to use that charismatic trait we were talking about early on in the podcast. The main thing that I fear with the whole crystal tradition is that it will slowly dissolve all purpose into purchase. And that's something that I'm extremely not okay with. I'm not a huge fan of purchasing things in the first place. I like personally crafting and using things within my land and my household and stuff like that to do what I need to do. But the current culture, I've seen people who are like, I can't do a love spell because I don't have rose quartz. I can't open my third eye because I don't have amethyst, which is so far separated from each other in origin that I just don't understand why it's become a modern day necessity. It's almost like an obsession that has become almost normalized. And I'm not saying that these practices don't hold value at all, but I am saying that it's very separated from what I believe to be the original purpose of the practices.
I think something that's really interesting to me about the crystals thing is that crystals have nothing in the slightest to do with traditional occultism. They are from the New Age movement. They're not even from they come from a New Age practice. They haven't been around for long at all. They have no basis in historical mysticism. You don't even need them if you don't practice New Age practice. And their value is so extremely overblown. Look through an old style grimoire. Let me tell you the amount of times they're going to mention crystals. 0. Read the Ars Goetia. Read the Sefer Yetzirah. Read the Ars Notoria. Read Gremiverum. Read Agrippa. Read Agrippa. Tell me how many times you hear crystals mentioned. Crystals are mentioned because right now, spirituality is a commodity and a trend that people have capitalized on. There is no need to study crystals. I'm tired of seeing crystals mentioned as an essential or something you should be studying first, because they're really negligible in the history of occultism. They're a modern fad, a fad driven by the desire to capitalize off spirituality, which has been happening for a very long time. And so whenever anyone really pushes crystals, they just become skeptical to me, especially if they're not a New Ager and they're not teaching New Age practice, because crystals have no value outside of the New Age practice. And I also, your point about aesthetic, I wanted to touch on that too. I think we're drawn to people who have a good aesthetic, and people are picking who they follow, who they approve of, because now spirituality has a big following on Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest, and all these sites that are very visually focused, based on aesthetics rather than quality. And I don't want anyone believing aesthetics equals bad quality, because that is something I've seen a few people pushing, that if something's aesthetic, it must be bad, which is a major falsehood and a huge misconception. But just be mindful of your sources and check the historicism. If you are reading a list of beginner things and it only mentions super new concepts, things that have come up in the past 30 years, be skeptical of that, because there's this massive history of practice that goes far, far back before the New Age, the Golden Dawn, Wicca, like all this stuff is completely new. And so I think you should be looking at the age, the history, and whenever you're interested in a new tradition, always know the history of that tradition, because that's really important to understanding the full context. Like a lot of people think Wicca is very ancient, and that's categorically untrue. It comes through Thelema, through the Golden Dawn, and then through medieval traditions handed down. And so I think you should just always know the history of things, and when you're talking about a guru, they should, honestly, they should have a good understanding of the history of the practices they're teaching. I think knowing scripture and history is just something that you should always be looking for when you're looking for a coach or a practice or something to follow.
And it seems to come all back down to money. And that's where you should get critically thinking about how much is this information worth and why do I want it? Because if you are looking for a guru and they're charging insane prices for very little knowledge, then you don't need them. Because like I said before, you can just get that information elsewhere. All information is becoming a lot more available these days, and when you're paying these insane amount of things for tools, mentors, etc., you're going to be falling short of what you're actually looking for.
Something a lot darker than material money that I wanted to talk about that I've been seeing in guru-mentee relationships. So I'd like to give a slight trigger warning for sexual content for the next section. I'll leave a timestamp to jump to if you want to miss this. But a big thing I see, especially in certain practices more than others, especially Thelema. You see this a lot in various Thelemic groups. I've noticed there's a lot of, or any practice that has a large sexual side to it, or a lot of sex implied, or sexual practices, tantra as well. If you're learning something that has sexual practice from someone, no one should pressure you to sleep with them because that's the only way you can learn something. Like, say you're in a martial arts class, to teach you how to break someone's arm, does the teacher need to break your arm? No, they don't. So if you're learning about sexual practice, your mentor, and you should never let your mentor force you into sex with them or convince you to have sex with them, because that will be the only way you can learn it. Or if you're in a group where you feel extremely sexualized, or you're not being protected from sexual contact, or you feel like people are really creeping on you, especially if you're a younger woman, you just need to stand up for yourself and harshly say no, because I think this is something that people really, you think you wouldn't be someone who would be pressured into this stuff until you are. There's a lot of I know we always say the occult community is this happy, smiley, amazing place where everyone's so nice and it's so welcoming, and to a large degree it is. I feel very loved in this community, but there are a lot of people who are not really, sexual assault and abuse in our communities does happen, and if it happens to you, please speak out. Please, please, please speak out, and please spread the message of your group and your mentor, and just be open about this. And you don't have to, of course, but a lot of people get sexually abused by their mentors or pressured into it by older people of an organization they're in, or just sexualized or asked to get nude there's no reason anyone should ever get you naked. Okay, first of all, if an organization requires that and you're not comfortable with that, leave. It's not the right place for you. Don't worry about, you're missing some sort of great teaching or some great truth, because... No. Just fucking move on. Sorry for swearing, but I get really passionate about this. But, if you're not comfortable with something, get out. And as a woman, I'm telling you, it can be scary to stand up to men, especially older men who, if you're in a room alone with older men, that's a scary situation, and even if they're friendly and nothing's happening, it can be really, really nerve-wracking, but just bluntly say no. Your boundaries are your boundaries, and no one needs to sleep with you for you to astral project or something ridiculous. I've heard all these horrible stories, and it's like, no one has an entitlement to your body, no matter if they're the most famous occultist in the world, no matter if it's literally Solomon himself. Like, nobody has a right to you, and you have bodily autonomy, and no one can make you do anything you don't want to, and you should never join a group if you feel like you're forced to do something. Like, who cares if you're a Wiccan and you really want Gardnerian teachings and you have to get skyclad if you want to work with other people? Just teach yourself. Like, this happens so often to women, and it just breaks my heart for all my sisters out there who have dealt with this. It's like, you stand up for yourself, and have strength, and like, you don't have to take shit from people, and just grow up. Like, you have the power in you to stand up and assert your boundaries and stop this shit before it happens, because if you're worried about it, it could, and you should just always be aware. And just, if you're in any community with sexual practice, or if you're even like doing it voluntarily and you're really on board with it and it doesn't make you uncomfortable, just know your boundaries and know that you can always stop and you can always leave. And there's no community, there's no teacher who, if you don't see them or work with them, your journey is over. Or like, if you leave this group or this mentor, like, you have no future, or whatever scary catastrophizing thought you're having, like, your path will go on, and in the end, your ascent and relationship with divinity and the occult is your own personal relationship, and no one else is going to do that work for you, and that you never need another person. Like, in the end, like, the best occult work happens alone. The study happens alone. You can do these amazing group rites and have good results, but in the end, like, it's your experience and your personal ability is what's going to get you there. And so never feel like you need to do something or stay with some group or be with some guru or sacrifice your own personal view on sex and your own body, or give your body to someone who just wants to take advantage of you, and probably, if they're forcing you to have sex with them or get naked, like, they don't really care about you. They're not really looking out for your growth, and they may lie and they may gaslight you, but you have the power, and you should never, ever, ever feel like you have to do something sexual with someone or with your mentor. And if your mentor, like, it's extremely unprofessional for your mentor to flirt with you also. If your mentor or teacher is flirting with you, that's a huge, huge boundary problem, and just so unacceptable. And I just remember, like, stay strong, and you are loved, and you can always message me on my Instagram. It's linked below. If you're dealing with one of these situations, I'm here for you, and your journey is more than what some man is forcing you to do. So, trigger warning over. I just really needed to get that out.
Definitely, my end piece on this entire thing is, honestly, when it comes to gurus, from what I've seen, or not even gurus, when it comes to people who peddle you information, information that is not that hard to find, information that is overpriced, it is most likely something you already know. It is something that you already have the knowledge for. I think a lot of people don't credit themselves for how much they do know. I know that I don't. I always say I know very little, because that's what I think I do, but in reality I understand that I know a lot, but I still think I know very little. And I think trying to find answers, not by purchasing them, but going out and doing the work of reading, studying, researching, talking to people, developing community, maybe talking to teachers, not necessarily taking any of their courses, but creating correspondence with people in your community is always a good thing. But if they shove you off and are like, you need to take my courses, unless you really trust them and you see that they're an outstanding member in your community, I wouldn't give them a dime. Unless you have high trust for them, they're an outstanding member of your community, they can provide sources, they can provide exterior sources from where their knowledge comes from, because ultimately what a teacher is supposed to do is supposed to pre-digest information for you and then kind of spit it and regurgitate it into your mouth like you're a little baby bird. outside of that, make sure that you maintain authority over yourself and don't let people manipulate you in any way, shape, or form, be it monetary or otherwise, monetary, spiritually, anything like that. And I think that if you are willing to pay $400 on a course, I hear there's a bookstore where they have first edition Crowley books, so maybe get that instead. Just a thought. And then send it to me.
I'll wrap up by saying, at the end of the day, you don't need to spend a ton of money on tools, mentorship, etc. You don't need to find someone to teach you, because I know a lot of people feel like they need to find someone to teach them or they'll be blocked off from spiritual knowledge, when you can do your own research and you can find your own answers. If you are in a situation where you are in a mentorship, make sure that it is safe. Make sure that you aren't being manipulated in any way, shape, or form. Make sure that you feel like you are learning at a steady pace and that you are actually gaining something from it. If you aren't gaining anything, you can always leave.
Are just always be skeptical, always be questioning, and be very aware of your own value. And I think the thing that is the most important when it comes to all this stuff is the majority of the work and the majority of finding your own personal gnosis is something you do alone and something you do with the divine. And no matter what tradition you're in, whether you follow Kabbalah, whether you follow Asatru, whether you're a Chaot or a Luciferian or a Wiccan or whatever floats your boat, in the end, like that, those experiences that are going to give you the most mystical growth and the most personal knowledge and empowerment are the ones that you're going to have alone with the divine, or whatever your concept of the divine is. That's not through things or anything. That's all you in that. Like, the information you find and the resources and the practices are what helps you get there, and studying all that gives you all the information to know how to best proceed. But in the end, like, the work is your own, and the work is what happens when you kind of jump into it and you take that risk. And it's a lot of internal things. It's a lot of, like, the books teach you everything you need to know, but you're the one who has to apply that knowledge, and no one can tell you how to do that. Like, a lot of this is just, you have to do it. Like, you study for so long, but, like, the actual experiences are your own, and that's beyond, like, a physical thing. You get these experiences that you can't even comprehend or fully explain or break down easily. It's just, at that point, there's no guru, there's no little degree title or like a little like achievement. There's no little red ribbon. You can't have a diploma on your wall and do that work for you. That's all you. And that's what happens alone when you're in your little space and you're experiencing something that you can't even comprehend. Like, that's, no title is gonna do that for you. No, like you can't flex, like, I've read this many books in that moment. In that moment, you're in that moment, and you're experiencing it firsthand, and you're having that personal gnosis, and that's nothing that can be taught. That's nothing that anything, like owning a pretty little altar, is gonna give you. That's you, and there's nothing beyond that. And anyone who's telling you that you can pay your way into that position and pay your way into attainment and ascension, like, that's crap. And anyone who's saying that is wrong, because transcendence, or whatever your goal is with all of this, like, that's yours and yours alone, and you know what you need to do. And the beginning of wisdom may start with a book or with talking to someone, but the completion, the movement from wisdom to understanding, is a bridge you have to traverse on your own. And I just think you should remember that, and always be studying, always be talking to people, always be learning, but just know that, like, in the end, your experiences are yours, and who gives a shit if you talk to the nicest mentor ever or have spent thousands of dollars on this shit? Like, that's you. And I just think your attainment is your attainment.
Before we go, this is a thank you, a gesture of gratitude to Olivia over at the Witch of Wonderlust for sharing our content with her viewers. Olivia, we appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for doing that. And this has been Chandler.
This has been Georgina.
I have been Aiden.
And you have been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. Have a lovely day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, 3 a.m., whatever time it is, wherever you are. In May, you have the greatest journey and the greatest exploration on your personal journey to whatever it is you're trying to achieve with all of this.
My online course, $995 a month.